My name is Dan Bonnet, and I will be taking you through assignment 4.3, part 1, data collection. So first of all, what is a case study? It is an in-depth investigation of a single person, event, or community. Usually data is collected from methods like interviews and observations, and the majority of the time it will be through an unstructured interview so that the conversation is free and flowing. The main thing about case studies is that they're more often than not longitudinal, and so could take up to a few years to complete. So for example, a case study could include measuring anthropometric figures on an under 18 female British gymnast and see how they differ over a period of 10 years. Here the researchers would get a proper insight of the figures shown and can get a complete understanding of how they develop and change over the time. Now on to the advantages and disadvantages of case studies. One advantage of them is that they are rich in detail. Due to how in-depth the researcher goes into an individual or group, they are able to retrieve a lot of information that would not otherwise be present or available if a shallower level of research was taken. Another advantage is they help experimenters adapt new ideas and novel hypotheses for later testing. And finally, the results can be used to improve lifestyles. This is because researchers can find out ways to help an individual become mentally or physically healthier. For example, if a gymnast's anthropometric figures were too low, they could be borderline underweight, and so the researcher would see that from the data and encourage them to put on weight to become healthier. However, some disadvantages are that it can be biased, as it's literally a case of a researcher talking to their participant, making it one-on-one, and therefore the researcher could ask specific questions to try and get the answer they want. Also, it's time-consuming, and they cover a big period of time. And finally, data can't always be linked to general public because there is only one set of results by one participant, so it lacks external validity. Now on to cross-sectional design. This involves the data collected from more than one case study at a single point in time to collect a range of qualitative and quantitative data in connection with two or more variables. This data is then examined to try and find any critical patterns or associations. It's observational and involves recording information without manipulating the environment. So the different things participants could differ in is the range of their age, gender and background. And then an example would be recording the scores of 5 different female British gymnasts on floor with ages 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15. This way you get a range of different results from different age participants on which you can compare against each other to see if there are any critical patterns. So an advantage of this research is that it's quick and easy, as well as it being cheap. And then finally, the findings from the research can be analysed to create new in-depth research. Then some disadvantages are that this type of research doesn't help to determine the cause and effects. So this relates to how and why certain outcomes happened. Then also the timing of snapshot may not be a typical example. On to longitudinal design. This is another observational research design and so looks at observing participants, but this time the researcher does not influence the participants in any way. It measures the same variables over a long period of time and again could be up to a large amount of years. It uses the same participants and compares their developments and changes at different times over a long period of time, so this links back with the case study with measuring anthropometric figures. An example of a longitudinal study would be looking at the changes in heart rate for 50-year-olds who go for a walk every day for 10 years. Due to how long the time frame is, this makes the research longitudinal because it's recording different results each day for 10 years. Now the pros and cons of longitudinal research. The first one is that they are effective in determining variable patterns over time. The reason this is because as the collection of data is recorded in long periods of time, researchers can determine patterns efficiently, so they can learn a lot more about the causes and effects of relationships. In addition, they are highly flexible, so this means the focus they use can be shifted while researchers collect data. And finally, they provide high accuracy when observing changes. As they are the best method for conducting development over time, they can make observation of changes more accurate. A comparative research design is to do with using the same methods to compare two or more meaningfully contrasting cases. Researchers look for comparisons and contrasts between the two or more different sets of data. So the individuals or groups of individuals used will be similar in some respects, but will differ to some extent so that a comparison can actually be made. An example of a comparative research design would be measuring and comparing the results of female British gymnasts aged 12 and 15 in the vertical jump. This way you get two sets of data that record the same things and can compare for any critical patterns, similarities and differences. So an advantage of this research design is that they are easy to rank because you can see who had the best results by comparing all the data. Linking with this, you can create tables for the data and evaluate the similarities and differences. And then finally, you can compare the results to normative data so the researcher could give any ways to improve or maintain the results. However, one disadvantage is that the research can be biased. For example, the researcher could be writing down the result recorded by them personally. However, when it comes to comparing it to normative data, the results could be completely at the different end of the spectrum. The penultimate research design is the correlational design. This determines the extent of a relationship between two or more variables and attempts to find out whether an increase or decrease in one variable is the cause of the other variable increasing or decreasing. An example of a correlational research design would be seeing if a female British gymnast, if their weight affects how high they can push off the vault. This is correlational because one variable is the gymnast's weight, and the researcher is testing how that variable affects the dependent variable, which is how they can push off the vault. However, the reason this differs from an experimental research design is because there are no variables that are manipulated at all by the researcher during the study. So just as the other designs, there are pros and cons. An advantage is that as correlational research takes place outside the study, the results tend to be more applicable to everyday life. Also, they determine whether there is a link between two variables, and then finally they allow researchers to collect more data than experiments. However, to counterbalance, there are some cons. The first one is that they only uncover a relationship and can't draw a conclusion as to why. However, this isn't much of an issue because as researchers can determine the strength and direction of a relationship, this means in later studies they can narrow down the findings and maybe even determine a causation experimentally. Then the other con is that it doesn't reveal which variable influences the other. This is the final research design discussed in the video, and that is the experimental design. An experiment is a procedure carried out to support or oppose a hypothesis. They give researchers insights as to what outcome occurs when a specific variable is manipulated. The variable manipulated is the independent variable, or the IV, and the rest of them are kept constant, or known as control variables. During the study, there is a control group which acts as a sort of baseline to compare other groups against to see how results are affected due to the manipulation of the IV. The outcome variable that's caused by the IV is called the DV, or dependent variable. An example of an experimental case study would be seeing if substance A affects female gymnast scores on floor by increasing their power. This is experimental because there is a control group who have a placebo of the substance and then an experimental group that take the actual substance, and the researcher compares the two sets of data to see how the substance affected their power and scores on the floor. Finally, for the last pros and cons, one advantage is that the results can be repeated and therefore can be checked and verified. Another advantage is that they take place in a controlled environment and can therefore achieve better results. And finally, this type of research is the most appropriate way of collecting data and establishing whether or not one or more factors cause a change in an outcome. This is largely down to the controlling of extraneous variables. However, some disadvantages are that it may not be possible to control all extraneous variables. They can create artificial environments, so they won't represent real life, and then reactions of subjects may differ in real life settings. Okay, so now we move on to primary and secondary data. Primary data is data that is collected by a researcher where there has been no previous research done on that particular experiment before. An example would be if a researcher was to test the effect of a drug on female gymnasts' flexibility and there had been no other previous research based on that experiment before. That would be primary data. However, secondary data is data that is collected by a researcher where there has been previous research done on that particular experiment before. An example of that would be relating back to that first example. If there had been research done on that flexibility experiment before, the researcher would be collecting secondary data. And on to the pros and cons for both. One pro for primary data is that it's direct, meaning it is research straight from the researcher and it is all their work. Another advantage is that it's reliable because it's objective as it is coming from a specific field. However, a disadvantage of it is that there is a risk of bias. This is because the researcher is the first one to conduct a piece of research and so might conduct it in a certain way in which they get all the results they want to receive, rather than the results happening naturally. Secondly, it is time consuming. Secondly, it is time consuming because it takes up a lot of time to set up the experiment and get all the right resources. Finally, it is expensive because there is a great deal in preparation and doing questionnaires and interviews for participants. Some advantages for secondary data are the fact that it is cheap because having access to primary data is cheap and inexpensive compared to carrying out primary data collection methods. Another one is that there is insight and support from other researchers online that can help with the experiment the researcher wants to carry out, boosting the chances that the study will be valid and the results will be reliable. However, a disadvantage of secondary data is sometimes comparisons may be invalid. The reason this is because the way things are measured would have differed over time, and so making historical comparisons could be very hard. Also, the data would be unreliable because you have no idea where the data has come from and therefore don't know if it's reliable or not. Now we move on to levels of measurement. There are 4 different levels of measurement, and these can be remembered in the acronym NOIR. The N stands for nominal, and this is categorical. The O stands for ordinal, and this is categorical and numerical, and these two are both qualitative measurements. The I stands for interval, and this is numerical, just as the R, which stands for ratio, which is also numerical, and these two are more quantitative measurements. So first of all, we have nominal data. This is the least informative, as this data can be put into categories and are mutually exclusive. This just means that two things are very different and so aren't related in any way. For example, blue eyes and main sport played, they're not related in any way. Categorical data can take on numerical values, however they don't have any mathematical meaning, hence it's qualitative and not quantitative. Next we have ordinal data. This is more informative and relative. Categories are organised in an ordered sequence. This time, however, the numbers do have meaning, unlike in nominal data, and the difference between the categories is unknown. An example of ordinal data would be the places that girls come in a gymnastics competition, as they are ranked first, second, third. This is ordinal data. Thirdly, we have interval data. This is more to do with quantitative data, and this time there is a numerical scale with a meaningful order. Unlike ordinal, the distance between the scales are equal and continuous in nature. Also, with interval data, the numbers can go below 0 in a graph, thus making 0 meaningless. An example of interval data would be temperature, as that can go into negative numbers. Finally, we have ratio data. This is almost exactly like interval data in the sense that it's continuous. However, it hasn't got any meaningless 0. With ratio data, 0 means none, and all the values are on a smooth scale. An example of ratio data would be collecting the anthropometric figures from a female gymnast, as in those figures, 0 genuinely does mean 0.